Well, we're 5 deep, so we must be doing something right. We haven't thrown in the towel yet, buddy.
Yeah, it's going strong. I love it.
And here we are. ArachNerds, episode 5, part of the Herpeticulture Network, brought to you by FulviusApparel.com. Black Friday sale is going on right now. Site-wide, buy 2, get 1 free on everything. Or maybe you don't need that much stuff. Buy 1, get 1 half off. Helping out the people that maybe are buying for themselves. Maybe there's people buying for people for Christmas and stuff early, getting ahead of that. It is Black Friday sale month on Fulvius. So from now until November 30th at like 11:59 p.m., that sale is automatically discounted at checkout. There's no code or nothing. So grab it while you can. October was a very slow month. Painfully slow, but it sounds like it was like that for pretty much everybody. So the sale's there. I figured like I could compete with everyone and their mom on the internet for Black Friday stuff, or I could just go ahead and get out the way because I did notice some people were getting some of their shopping done early. So I was like, let's go ahead and just get it out of the way now and make it a monthly thing. And then I'm sure I'll carry something over into December as we get closer and closer to the holidays. So just stay tuned for that. Facebook, Instagram. Any questions or anything, shoot me a message on Facebook, Instagram, email. FulviusApparel.com is the website. FulviusApparel@gmail.com is the email address. And other than that, we're back. I feel like we're going to be extreme. We warned Nick to be prepared for a lot of stupid questions because I feel like we both have a lot of stupid questions. But real quick, do you have anything update wise that we need to exclaim from the rooftops?
No, nothing major invert wise. I realize I probably won't be able to keep anything for the next at least like month or two. I'm going through like my apartment's kind of small, so I'm going through a strict kind of quarantine protocol with my reptiles, and one of them does include kind of like a tick or not tick, a mite kind of just prevention thing. And as much as I was like saving bookmarks on a bunch of sites for different species of tarantulas and scorpions, I realized I'm like probably in a smaller apartment that isn't the best. That isn't the best, especially if my warmer room is my bedroom where I keep the main collection and everything. I don't really want to potentially expose them to that.
Right.
That would kind of suck. But other than inverts, I'm getting I'm pretty excited. I'm getting a 2.2 group of boa. I guess it's boa constrictor longicauda. So
oh hell yeah,
really want to work with them. I really love like the kind of naturally occurring IMG gene, increasing melanin gene, but I refuse to delve into the morphs when it comes to boas. I just like the wild types in themselves and their overall like life history traits kind of draw me in. And I used to keep them back in the past, so like I saw a decent group, some het anery animals, so that'd be cool to grow up.
That's awesome. I never outside of the Nicaraguans that I was heavy into years ago. I didn't really keep anything else outside of that. I had that pair of Tarahumaras, which I'm just kicking myself so hard still for getting rid of those because that was before they were kind of like a thing, and no one seemed to really care about them. But I had a pair, and they were angry, and they were awesome, and I parted with them, and now I regret it because seems like they're pretty tough to come across now. But
yeah, well, whenever I do end up producing some longicauda, I'll send you over some. They're well, at least the ones I had in the past, they were really chill, really mellow, and yeah, no, they're
well, that'll be a nice change of pace because the Nicaraguans I had were not chill.
Yeah,
not great. They were pretty, but they had no personalities. They were terrible.
I only had 2 Nicaraguans, and they were more feisty than like my Argentine that I keep right now as a baby and everything. And it's like kind of funny because those ones were the only ones to actually make like all the other boas that I've had when they would strike, they would kind of just like strike it there. They wouldn't like hit you,
Right, kind of
but
half-ass it.
the Nicaraguans would nail me all the
They're
time.
connecting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I just found that kind of funny. I'm like, you're so small, yet you're so
Yeah,
damn
it's weird. The
effective.
first one I ever had was a small female, and she was like super mellow. She was great. Like I could take her out, do whatever I wanted to. Like need to move her while I'm cleaning, whatever. She did great. Every other Nick that I had after that was just terrible. But they were pretty. I enjoyed them. Have a penchant for really, really angry snakes.
Yeah, if they're not defensive, it's not exciting.
Got to take the good with the bad. Got to have the balance, because like with the percentum and then the rhinos, like you get the angels and the devils. Got both sides of the spectrum there. But I mean, do you know what's on the hit list first when you are going to town on spiders and stuff?
Me, yeah. So as basic as it is, I want to stick kind of, well, I say I want to stick true to my roots and go to the large New World terrestrials like I have in the past, as but with everything that's going on, like the Formictopus genus getting a bunch of new quote unquote localities I don't really believe, and and the Pamphobedius genus, which is great and amazing, and I know a lot of people are working with them, but with more and more individuals coming in, I just really need to like sit down, focus, talk to some people, see what's really what out there.
Yeah,
Um, Xenestus, another one too. I know that there's just like a lot of new additions. I just don't want to end up with a bunch of the same like same species that are under different locality names just due to either some kind of like marketing gimmick or someone accidentally like mislabeling. Because just today I saw someone breeding a species mascara male with a species platyoma female, and I'm just like, that's that
there's a
kind of
special place in hell for you, buddy.
yeah. To the person's credit, he or I'm not sure what the saying is, but to the person's credit, he didn't know that they were two different species. He just received it in a loan, I believe. But it's just things like that. Like maybe I should stick with like more defined species. But I don't know. Seeing them in the wild kind of still like made me fall in love with them. But I'm also like wanting to expand out from what I've normally kept in the past. There's a lot of cool new genera and species that would be great
Your
to work with.
Facilitaria, dude.
Yeah, admittedly, yeah, yeah. I'd love to set up like a cool little enclosure for them, and like me being like Indian and my parents being from like a city that's nearby, or well, seeing as they used to live like somewhere nearby, where Poecilotheria could be found. I feel like, I feel like I kind of have to just to kind of like yeah put some respect on it, but.
Right.
Yeah, Rufilata would be, I think, my go-to one. I just love their greenish coloration, the size they get, and I still think like they're kind of a little bit underrated. I haven't seen as much hype for them
Yeah.
as like obviously Metallica. Metallica puts the genus on the map, and I know a lot of people are like obsessed with the Sri Lankan species, which is great. So they could be spread out across the hobby more. But like Rufilata, I feel like it comes more in waves.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, they're definitely kind of the black sheep of that genus in a way. Like they've always had sort of a stigma about them of being sort of the more chaotic of the genus, and obviously they don't have the blues and some of the purples and blacks and things that you see with Regalis and uh, the other species. But I agree. They've definitely have been on my list of stuff to get, because that's one of the pokies that I've not kept. But hopefully that does change within the next couple months or so. We'll see. I think Marshall Arachnids has them currently for sale,
oh, nice.
and they're reasonable. They were at Daytona and they had some, and they were I tossed around the idea of grabbing some while I was there, but ended up going with the Regalis and the Metallica. So
Yeah, I know Fear Not was having an event somewhat recently, and I'm up in Pennsylvania, so I'm not like horribly far from Virginia. So I was like tossing around the idea of doing that,
mhm.
just going down there, checking out what they have because I know they do a lot of breeding themselves.
Yeah, it'd
And
be cool to
I
see. They
just,
got a storefront and everything. It'd be neat to check that out.
yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
But I know they're
Well,
running sales. Everyone's running sales right now, so it's kind of hard to stay
yeah, that's what
away.
sucks, man. Because it's like everyone's gonna have Black Friday sales, and I'm like, there's too much stuff and not enough money.
Yeah, definitely get that.
Figures. My classy molted, and it is female.
Oh, congrats! I saw the
Shout out
photos.
to Dylan at Eight Deadly Sins because I sent him the picture and was like, "What you think?" And after talking to him about it and showing him the pictures, I went and watched some videos, and now it's so much easier. When I was like a kid and you went on ArachNerds boards and stuff, and you looked at pictures, people would like tell you to look for, uh, I don't know, it was so much more cryptic back then when it was explained to me, and so now I
Mhm.
watch it and I'm like, it makes complete sense. I'm like, that's easy enough. Like, but earlier everyone made it sound like when you were looking at molts that you had to have like a ridiculously good magnifying glass or like microscope to do it accurately, and like obviously the size of the molt matters, but I don't know. I just remember I watched the video recently and talking to you and Dylan, and it's like this is not nearly as complicated as I remember it being.
Yeah,
But
definitely. There's I'm blanking out his name. I think it's Devin. He works with a lot of Phonopalmo species, mainly the north the species in the United States, and he has this great setup which you could only dream of like back in like when I was browsing arachnoboards in like 2009. I think it's he mentioned it was like fairly it wasn't very expensive, but he could accurately identify a sex of like a I said, want to think that's like a half inch long,
mm-hmm.
like
Wow.
or like that's like with a molto. It's like it's pretty wild how like I remember back in the day. I'm like, oh, it would be dope if we could like if a normal hobbyist can figure out like the sex of
Mm-hmm.
like of some of the slings because I mean, it's still not going to stop me from buying like five at a time just to increase my odds and all. But like it would just be nice to know just for like feeding wise and like having pairs like slowing down some of the males once they hit a certain size or speeding up some of the females, keeping them a bit warmer, keeping the males a bit cooler,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. It would help out tremendously.
Yeah, and I mean, so my striata molted, and I knew that was a female when I got her because she was sold to me as a female. Um, my avicularia molted. I checked the molt on that. It looks to be female. My Metallica molted again, and that one's going to be a little tougher. I might have to buy a cheap microscope for that because that one is small still. Um, but knowing my luck with everything so far looking female, that I'm like, my Metallica is going to be a male. I just know it. Like, that's just what's going to happen. Everything else is going to be female, and the lone male that I have in the entire room is going to be that Metallica.
Hey, that's more of an incentive to get another one for a female.
Exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
I'm the kind that I'm the kind of person that's like too cheap to pay for a confirmed female, so I'll just buy like a lot of slings, like a five
Well,
lot
it's
or
like
like a
it's
three lot.
fun to raise them up too. Like I
Yeah.
enjoy watching them grow and watching them do their thing. It takes the fun out of it a little bit if you just buy a older adult.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, it's not like with like some reptile species where it's where they take quite a long time to mature, like 5 6 years or 3 years depending on the species, 2 years. Um, a lot of species outside like the more arid species that like a phonopalma, brachypalma, they take a while to mature.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a huge time investment, especially if you're coming from the reptile hobby. But again, it's like I've definitely been like cursing to myself when I like bought a five lot and they all turn out to be male and like in
Yeah, it's
general.
so
But
crazy because the odds of that are like really not high that you'd get all of one sex in a group of five like that.
yeah, I
You know?
definitely spent an arm and a leg once on some. This was back when some Pamphibedia species first came into the hobby. So the Colombian insignis, so like the true insignis nigri color, and what was it? I think it was just those two, and I spent more than I'm willing to admit on a group of each of them. They all were male, every single one of them.
Damn.
And this was back, and this was back when people were pointing fingers because like a lot of people ended up getting males of a lot of like more expensive species, and I think they were all coming from the same exporter.
Hmm.
So they're like, is this person going just like set like going through because like Pamphobedia slings are quite big. Um,
I'd
like,
imagine. Yeah.
and like once they pop out, so you could like sex them quite easily, or with like lower margin error, and yeah, so everyone was like, oh, it's like, is this guy just selling us all males and keeping all the females in Europe or whatever? But uh, they're in the hobby now, more well, I don't want to say more commonly, but the price is down significantly. So still kind of salty about it, so I'm unsure if I'll buy them. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, I want more classy for sure. I mean, that was a species that I was already sort of into when I got this one initially. Um, but as far as the brackies, man, like those in erratum, I love them, and I don't have any erratum, but I definitely want to get more classy and maybe eventually try my hand at breeding them sometime in the next like decade. Um, we'll see. I don't know. It sucks because that's not a species you see a ton of. And I mean, they're not the cheapest for sure, but uh, I don't know. I want to pursue them. I think that's similar to how bears rats are kind of the species of snake that I really became tied to, um, and rhinos for that matter. But like, I feel like classy are going to be that spider species for me, just because they are gorgeous as far as the brackies go. Like the colors on this one I have, even though it's small, are just they pop. It's crazy. It's
yeah,
wild.
definitely. I think they're one of the more unique looking Brachypelma.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get me wrong, like Smithy or Autumn, and those are great looking, but they still have kind of like the knees going on. Um,
I like erratum because I like the pitch black body and legs of erratum with the highlighted knees. Like with Himori and Smithy, you have the oranges and the whites and stuff in the mix there. But like with erratum, it's like that's a black spider with flame knees. Like it's they look awesome. I just like the look of them.
can't go wrong with a good one.
Mm-mm. And those seem to be much more available now than they used to be too. Like when I was younger and interested in them, they were tough to come across. But now it's there's like 3 websites off the top of my head I know I can go there right now and they've got some for sale and they're actually fairly reasonable price wise. Like they're not outlandish like they were 10 plus years ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Speaking of outlandish prices, scorpion prices are going up now. I don't know. I was talking to you and Phil, and I told you like how much I got these like because like Centroroides bicolor
yeah,
four back today. I got like
like
3 for 30, and now they're just like
they
30 to
ain't
40
that
each.
buddy. Yep.
I'm just like that's wild to me.
Yep. And even I mean, hey, some of like the Hodentata and some other stuff, some of the rare Centroroides, it's that I've never seen for sale. Really, it's like I would understand that those would be a higher price, but those, yeah, bicolor. I've seen a couple on Morph Market here and there over the last couple weeks, but I don't see any on there right now. So I'm waiting. I'm gonna pounce when I can, but
Definitely hit up Jeff Acors and get on his waiting list if he's going to be producing some.
mm-hmm.
Um, he produces a metric crap ton of scorpions, and he's a great guy. I think I got most of my Centroroides, Titius, and then some Hadentata and Lyris from
Mm-hmm.
him. But it was mainly like the New World kind of like bark scorpions from
Yeah,
him.
yeah. He's as far as I can tell, he's got probably the most diverse collection of Centroroides in the country. I don't see
Yeah,
anybody else keeping the spectrum of species of that genus.
and that's great, especially because more so than tarantulas, I feel like scorpions are not as worked with like as much. I've noticed like there's a Facebook group that I think I added you to. It's called the Scorpion Hobby, and that's where generally like the meeting place for like a lot of scorpion enthusiasts outside of. I'm not sure if people are still active
I
on
think I joined
arachnivores.
that one.
but a lot of other larger people usually keep them and breed them are like are getting out of the hobby. So it's still nice to see some people working with them, and some of the species, especially with scorpions as a whole, are a bit more challenging to breed at times than tarantulas, or more unfamiliar to just like an arachnid enthusiast. So it's nice to see him still going strong. And he does like check-ins and as well. Like I remember like a couple months after like I bought some from him, he would check in like, hey, how are they doing? Are they all feeding fine? Are they all like molting fine and stuff?
Oh, that's good.
Great guy.
Yeah, I'll have to look. I don't know. I thought I joined that group, but now it's not coming up on Facebook at all. So
I'll share the link with you again too.
Yeah, I don't know. Facebook's got a mind of its own. Oh, we have another hurricane off the coast. That's nice. Speaking of good news, but we're here this episode. I won't say week because we don't do this every week as much as I want to. Here to talk about whip scorpions, Whipspiders. We'll get into which one they're supposed to be here in a second because I'm honestly not sure anymore. But we're joined by Nick Cazzaniga.
But
hey, how we doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm happy to be here and talk about stuff. So
we got a lot of questions.
I'm happy. Hey, I'll have a lot of answers, hopefully.
So we'll kind of, you can either give us sort of the detailed version or the Cliff Notes version of how you got into inverts, sort of your current collection, why whip scorpions and the like specifically, because you also are doing, as far as like academia, like you are, it's more than just you as like a hobby side of things, like you are doing academics. You just had a paper put out, so it's more than just keeping them. You're not just like, you know, myself or Sarg that just has some stuff in our rooms and we enjoy it. You know, you're out in the field doing things. So how did it, you know, how'd you get from A to B on that?
So, I mean, I've been someone who's always been super interested in inverts. I definitely, it's been from like a super young age kind of thing. I was always, you know, the bug kid out in the woods, all that kind of stuff. But I really started with exotics on the hobby side. When I was probably around like 11 or 12 years old, I went to my first reptile expo in White Plains, New York. And I found my first tarantula vendor table that way. And I got into the hobby really through tarantulas. And for the longest time, was the majority of what I kept. I had, you know, like 40, 50 species at a time.
Anything specific focus-wise there?
Oh, man. I mean, it's changed a lot over the years. I still keep a decent number of teas.
Okay.
These days, my favorites are Aphonopelma. I'm very big on Aphonopelma, especially like the native species. I think are really, really cool. But I really touched on almost everything, I think, during that kind of era for me of the hobby. But I really got into Amblypygids or Whipspiders. I got my first, again, when I was age, but I really didn't get invested until my undergrad. And that's when I picked up some Heterophrynus from Bugs in Cyberspace, which are these really beautiful, like, extremely large, lanky Amblypygids, the ones that you kind of always see the dramatic photos of that have, like, you know, the dinner plate leg span kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it's those that really like got me super invested in the hobby. And then academia kind of came along with the fact that that was always like my main interest, and so I always knew I wanted to do entomology for undergrad. And then, you know, as things got along and started thinking about grad school, I realized, you know, arachnids was really my big invested interest. And originally, I had some thoughts of doing higher education with tarantulas and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But more and more as I got graduated and applied to some programs, and COVID came together, and all that kind of derailed some things. I got really deep into my interest in Amblypygi, and that ended up turning into this graduate program that I've started into, and has really kind of snowballed to huge effect, both on the hobby side and on the academic side. As it is like the focus of my academics, I think they're one of the most interesting and understudied groups in terms of inverts out there.
Definitely.
I mean, there's so much we don't know about them, whether it's just an understanding of species and diversity, or their behavior and social interactions, and all kinds of stuff that you could go on and on about. But yeah, I guess that's kind of the basic background for me. But my interest, I will clarify, they are Whipspiders and not Whipscorpions. The Whipscorpions are the Europygids, the Vinegaroons and whatnot.
Okay.
Yeah, they're related, obviously,
Gotcha.
but it's a common confusion for a lot of people, and fairly so.
Yeah, I've always heard of them as Whipscorpions. I've never, like, Vinegaroons, I've always seen as Vinegaroons, and then Whipspiders have always been labeled as Whipscorpions. So I've never thought of there being a clear difference. But as far as like entomology goes, because I was talking to Nicole Tam, who also went to school for entomology, like, how much of that is really, because that's such a broad group to just for entomology, like, it's such a huge, massive amount of subject matter to cover there. Like, how much of that is actually sort of geared and focused on arachnids, just given the amount of other groups that you have to cover?
Yeah. Still connected? I think I dropped for a second there.
Oh, I thought I froze for a second.
Site-wide issue.
You're back.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There are very, very few dedicated arachnology programs, at least especially for undergrad. You're barely even likely to find a course that's taught just for arachnids. So a lot of the times they do, and your myriapods, your centipedes, millipedes, all that stuff get slammed into entomology and like loosely covered. But you really only get like a little bit from those kinds of courses. Obviously, a lot of the foundational stuff, when you're talking, the foundations of systematics, taxonomy, like the base sciences are the same. But you really don't get any of the coursework or details for the majority of kind of like undergrad courses or programs. So a lot of the kind of learning or whatever that I did in a lot of those regards is even, whether it's tarantulas, whether it's Amblypygi, is self-taught. It's going and reading papers. It's talking to specialists or reaching out to people. So it was a very much kind of a here and there journey for entomology. I'm super great for that program and for entomology in general. I still love the field. I was sometimes I'm jealous of the entomologists that can still be more generalized in some aspects. Obviously, entomologists in grad school also super specialize into their individual groups. But, there's a big wide world of inverts out there, and they're all really, really cool. So it's
do Lepidoptera get all the love?
Yes. Yeah. The beetles, like there are the favorite groups, of course. But
how difficult was it to find like a PI for your interest? Like, is your lab mainly focused on just like, are they focused on arachnids in general? Because I know when I was looking into graduate schooling, some of my interests when I reached out to labs, they're like, oh, the PIs, the professors would be like, I don't do that, but I will fund you, and you can kind of like reach out to other people and kind of and build your and build your connections through there. They'll be able to help you out, and we'll just like be the bridge for that. Or does your lab focus on how do you pronounce the order again? Amblypygi?
Amblypygi.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So I got very lucky To be perfectly honest with you, there are very, very few labs out there that do arachnid specific stuff, and the funding for that kind of work is very shallow. But I got super lucky. My lab focuses on arachnids in general. I would say the focus for the lab is mostly scorpions, but a lot of the understudied arachnid orders are also of interest in the lab. There are people working on schizomids, if you guys know what those are, super, super tiny cryptic arachnids. There are people who are working on the vinegar runes. There's been some interest to maybe have somebody start looking at solifuges, the sun spiders, that kind of stuff. So it's a really fantastic opportunity that I've gotten here at the museum and through CUNY to do this kind of work. And it really was kind of the perfect storm scenario. My funding is super patchwork. It's a little bit from my PI's grant, it's a little bit from CUNY, it's a little bit from the museum. So it was a super, super lucky opportunity. When I was originally looking at labs and reaching out to PIs, there's, like I said, only a handful that are really dedicated like this, and even that handful, there's a lot of them that are either maybe not taking students currently, maybe they're currently at capacity in terms of the lab, or there are a lot of people retiring in the field. There's only like a limited number of these kinds of positions at museums and other institutions. A lot of museums are also kind of shrinking their positions and condensing positions as far as curators go. In the past, even at the museum, there were more dedicated curators for arachnids, and now people are kind of taking on responsibilities of others as things shift around. So it's a dynamic thing, and it definitely was very lucky for me to be here.
Well, I'm glad it all worked out, because we definitely need more people focusing on this order. It's bringing more light to them too. And yeah, I do agree. Like when I was in the wildlife field, it seemed to be more and more difficult to land, especially positions within like museums, zoos. I used to work in the zoo in high school, and I was talking to the conservation biologist, the herpetologist over there, and I'm like, "Oh, how'd you get the job and everything?" And basically, they said the other person died, and so you kind of like live and die with those positions. And as the field grows, you're getting more and more applicants for that. But you being that like you're like part of like on the university side and also working in a museum, that's amazing. And yeah, that's really dope that you got it. So.
Yeah, and honestly, like I completely know where you're coming from in terms of like the animal care, like zoo side of things, because that's also my background. I worked at an aquarium for a little bit of time. I worked at an insect zoo on campus during my undergrad, and it is really a shame, like the limited kind of scope that we have even for inverts there. But fight the good fight. There's a lot of us out there that are interested in this kind of thing. And even like outside academics, like the hobby side of things can be super important. I know it's a lot of dedicated hobbyists that have been super influential in the field. I couldn't do what I do without the help of a lot of hobbyists. People going out there and understanding where to find certain things and whatnot. So.
Yeah, I know that, especially with the Fun and Palma too. A lot of like hobbyists go out and find things. They'll send coordinates to, I believe his name is Brett. I'm gonna.
Yeah. There's a couple of different people working on a Fun and Palma that, as I understand it, are working on the U.S. native stuff. I think Chris Hamilton.
Yeah.
Brent Hendrickson might be
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm friends with him on Facebook, and like he'll post his updates and everything and photos, and I just think it's like great how he's like incorporating also citizen science, just because like I do know that some people are not open to that, and I feel like you're pigeonholing yourself in that aspect, especially when working with more like with species that aren't like it's hard to get information on, and I don't know. I'm like just using all avenues of information is great, and
It
I think
definitely appears that as far as inverts go and the academic side of things, sort of there being a more of a symbiotic relationship between academia and the private sector seems to be much more prevalent in inverts than it does in reptiles, because in reptiles there's still I feel like a fairly large divide between academics and the private sector. Maybe it's just because there's so few people sort of in the private sector of inverts, especially solely inverts, you know, not having just them as kind of like just a little side thing they do, you know. So it is really nice to see that academia does recognize that there is value in the hobby and people keeping stuff, and you know, not just sort of brushing them off if they have information or things like that, and you know, being like whatever. So
Yeah, I think it's interesting, honestly, that I think there is like there was in the past like a more level of divide or like I don't want to say like elitism per se, but you know a distinct like disjunction between the two. But it almost feels like, especially like as you know time has gone on and like the next generation of scientists are more involved in the community and in being you know willing to connect with citizen scientists. Um, and I really feel that a lot of the upcoming, or I wouldn't even say like even more than upcoming, just in general, the more that I talk to especially a lot of these like super specialized scientists or these people that are working on these super obscure groups, a lot of them always you know have some root in the hobby to begin with. You know, these are all people that you know kept a spider or scorpion in a box at some point, and were interested in that kind of thing, and got interested by you know working hands-on with these animals. And I think that that's like a very important part of the hobby for me. Is you know that's how I got invested in this kind of thing. You know, I wouldn't have been exposed to it without the hobby, and so I think it's a huge boon that the hobby provides to science, is you know getting people these hands-on experiences and getting them invested in these animals that they otherwise wouldn't you know even know about. Now, there are people that I talk to a lot of the time when I talk about Whipspiders, who will see it, and you know the famous example that people get in media is there's a tailless whip scorpion used. That's
Harry Potter,
one of the
right?
other common names. Yeah, in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
So and I'll have people go, oh wow, I thought that was fake. You know, I thought it was just like a thing for Harry Potter. So it's crazy. You know, the level of exposure the hobby gives is you know not to be understated, I think.
Yeah, funny that you mentioned that. I was actually talking to some friends and everything, and this like this podcast was brought up, and I brought up how I'm like stoked to have you on and everything, and talk about this. And they're asking what the topic is. Mind you, these aren't arachnid or even wildlife people in general. And the way I described it, I'm like, oh, do you remember in this Harry Potter scene and everything? And they're like, that thing's real. And I'm like, yeah, it is.
Exactly.
But yeah,
which movie was it? Which one?
it's the fifth one, I think.
Okay, I don't even
Oh,
think I saw
It,
I
it.
know.
it
I
might be
know.
the fourth, I think.
Okay,
Actually.
God. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
with Mad Eye Moody.
Mad Eye Moody, yes.
Yeah, there you go. So
That's
yeah,
right.
it's the fourth one when he was like doing one of the curses. Oh, I'll digress. My Harry Potter knowledge is very small right now.
Yeah, like I said, after like Prisoner of Azkaban, I checked out as far as the movie thing went. You know, I need to watch. My kid is reading the series, and so after she finishes the book, we watch the movie. So I think we're up to the Azkaban one right now. So we're getting there. It is in a weird sort of full circle way, though. Like if you think about it, when academia is in contact and sort of updating the private sector, especially when it comes to like taxonomy and sort of the status of certain species and in the wild and you know, conservation wise and stuff, like you would think it would make more sense to keep the private sector clued in because of how much we see things mislabeled. Like Sir was saying, you know, people breeding things that aren't the same, that maybe they don't realize aren't the same. Like how much of that stuff could sort of be curbed if the conversation was more open as far as like, hey, here's what's actually going on taxonomically. Like here's what you're actually looking at. It's not whatever you bought it as. It wasn't just a marketing tool for somebody, or even conservation wise saying like, hey, we just did a study on X, Y, and Z and the numbers are looking real low. So if you have these in captivity, like you might want to start prepping, because it may be like an India or Sri Lanka situation where they're like, yeah, you can't even move these across state lines anymore. So it seems smart to post updates, like you're saying Brent does with the Phonopelma stuff and things like that, to keep everyone sort of clued in and on the same page.
Yeah, and even like Valker, he's more than happy to. Again, I'm not saying do this. Check legalities of wherever you're at. I know he's asked for. He's like, oh, do you need help like identifying what words, like with the whole haplopelma and Cereopagopus thing. And he's like, if you want to send me molts, and he's like, I could help identify what species you are currently working with on there. So it's really great to see people do that, because I do know that when I was working down in South America, when I was when I came across like a tarantula that hadn't been identified before, the professor I was working with, he reached out to someone in one of the museums down there, and they had a very negative opinion on the hobby back then, about like them not willing to like change, or the hobby not willing to change or adapt and grow and everything. But that was what, over 10 years ago. So now that's and so it's good to see like the perception has changed, and people are willing to change and take in new information on both
and
sides.
Learn. Yeah.
Although like you still will get someone saying that like, no, this is like my like rosea or something, and it's clearly mislabeled. But for the most part, it's
you can only go so far, but in general, it's improved. Yeah. Where do Whipspiders sit in sort of the grand scheme of arachnids? Because from what I understand and the brief bit of research I did do, they are fairly primitive, I guess, on the hierarchy of things. So sort of where do they sit on the family tree of arachnids?
I think you mean whip scorpions.
All of them,
spiders,
both of them.
if we're
Yeah,
talking
both
about
of them.
Amblypygi.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
But yeah. So they're both whip scorpions and whip spiders. Europygi and Amblypygi are related. They're related to the scorpions and spiders. They're all part of arachnids and what have you. They are definitely a lot more conserved as far as like how much they've changed since their inception, you could say. I won't go into too much like nitty gritty as far as like phylogenetic placement stuff, but if we're talking about
if you want to, though, feel free. Like we're sponges here to absorb.
So I guess probably the most interesting thing to talk about is I guess the current estimates of the origin for Amblypygi is something like 315 million years, I want to say, off the top of my head. I'd have to go and double check that. But I mean that's predating the dinosaurs. That's ancient history, and they've remained relatively the same since then. I mean there are some morphological changes in the modern Amblypygids, particularly like the articulation of the pedipalps has changed, but this general body plan of the antenniform first set of legs, the raptorial pedipalps, and all that is all the same. And it's worked for them for a very, very long time. And I guess to talk a little bit about like their phylogenetics, there's an interesting. Give me a second to kind of coordinate my thoughts here, but there's kind of an interesting relationship between the different clades of Amblypygi that I guess people don't usually see. Like I would say that, especially from a hobbyist perspective, a whip spider is a whip spider, right? Mm-hmm. So looking at the two probably most common species you get in the hobby all the time that are wild caught, you've got your Damon medius from Africa, your Phrynis whitei from Nicaragua, and people look at them and say, oh, whip spider, same thing. But when you really start looking at their morphology and the way they behave, I mean, you actually get good, clear morphological difference and diversity between these groups, where even like the way they hunt is different. Their ecological niche is different. And so you actually end up with a lot more true differences and diversity across Amblypygi than just, that's a whip spider. For example, like some of those African and Asian species are what I would call spear hunting species. So that, your traditional, like when you think of a raptorial appendage, you think of like mantises, where they'll grab something, they've got all these spines to cage it, and there are Amblypygi that function like that, like a lot of your Phrynis, like that Phrynis wide-eye that I mentioned before. But there are Amblypygi among other genera like Euphrynicus and Phrynicus that are what I would call spear feeding. So you have the same, body plan, same setup, but the palps are a little bit more elongated, maybe less spinose, and the primary spines are like where the, I guess you would call the hand of the pedipalp. And so rather than grasping, they actually will stab and puncture prey that way and bring it in. But unless you've actually got them in front of you and you observe that, people kind of overlook that element of morphology and diversity. So they've retained that same body plan for a very long time, but there's a lot more specialization than people give credit for. And you also have, elements of sex differentiation and sexual dimorphism. There's a lot of, I'm sure you've seen videos online of the species Euphrynicus amonica, where the males have the super, super long, thin pedipalps. That are just like comically large, that we're still, working to understand, why and how that sexual dimorphism comes about. So yeah, a bit of a ramble as far as that goes, but hopefully that's like, somewhat meaningful.
Yeah, that was all great. I mean, like I'll be the first to admit that I was ignorant when it comes to the overall diversity of the order itself. I mean, I was going off of better for worse, what the hobby representation was with them. And as you said, it's usually like Damon, I believe that the pronunciation is, and that's what you would see the most readily available. So I'm just like, oh, it's like in my head, I remember like at one time I'm like, oh, this is probably like a monotypic genus, or
Right.
and that there's that there's not much diversity. But it wasn't until like we became friends on Facebook. I know we talked a bit on arachno boards, I think, like back in the day, and that's how I ended up like quote unquote meeting you and everything. But it wasn't until I added you, and you were posting a lot about your collection and just like species you work with. Congrats on the breeding of the you just pronounced the scientific name, but
oh yeah, the Euphrynicus amonica.
yeah, congrats on that.
Thank you.
But yeah, so I guess I just have like one quick question. So in the hobby right now, not back like that decade ago or so, but would you say like there's more species entering in the hobby that kind of exhibit that wide array of like hunting strategies? Because like I'm not gonna lie, I mean, like after even this short discussion, it's like it's piquing my interest, and I'm definitely gonna look into it more. But I was just wondering, like, is there like representation of like the entire of the variety of the genera that display these different hunting tactics in the hobby, or is it just like mainly just a few and the rest? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it's interesting. As far as like the hobby in general goes, it's very disjointed depending on where in the world you are. For the US, I mean, the Amblypygid hobby, I would say, has absolutely exploded in the last like couple of years. There are things accessible now that were not accessible, like you wouldn't even dream were accessible years ago. But Europe has been ahead of us, as is usual in a lot of these things for a while. But it's also the case where these things are so obscure in terms of keeping. Like, there's only so many people in the US who are even like interested in breeding Amblypygi, period. That even when they do pop up, you might have an import of like 10 animals of a species, and then you never hear about it again because they're in like 2 collections. Even if they're bred, like nobody really talks about it. And so for a long time now, my mission has been kind of trying to accumulate as many species as possible, breed them, and disperse them throughout the hobby to make them really accessible. because, for example, that genus Euphranicus contains two valid species, and the other one that isn't a monica, Bacillifer, has been, here and there in the hobby for a long time now. But I would say it hasn't been, even remotely wildly captive bred or, generally available to the public consistently at all. So it's really changed a lot in the last few years, at least from my experience. And I've been trying to do my part to contribute to that. I've been coordinating some imports of new species, both Canada and Europe, from dedicated breeders, and it's changed a lot. You have now species that have those different hunting strategies. We now have access to Acanthophrynus, the super large, heavy-bodied, colorful Amblypygids from Mexico. We have access to Carinus, these super teeny tiny, some even parthenogenic, like leaf litter dwelling, log dwelling Amblypygii that are super cryptic. So there is a lot of diversity that has kind of come into the hobby just pretty recently. I think there's really been an explosion, not just of accessibility, but of interest in the hobby. And it's really great to see. I've had a lot more people, get in contact with me that are interested, getting their first Amblypygid or interested. Like, I even have people reach out to me from the perspective of not understanding that there are multiple species, just that, Whipspiders are a thing. And then they start doing research, they get super invested, and it's been really cool to see in that regard. But it's definitely a recent development, at least for the US.
I can't help but think that maybe the explosion of jumping spiders had a hand in that, as far as those getting so popular. I feel like those have opened just an entirely new door for so many people that, whether they were arachnophobic or not, just going to shows now and seeing the amount of people that have jumping spiders and jumping spider supplies is just wild. But I've never seen so many people getting into just keeping spiders and stuff in general.
Yeah.
With the explosion of those. So I would like to think that it probably has something to do with that, at least to a degree.
Yeah,
I would honestly. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I definitely like and like I have some friends from when I was in the plant hobby and everything. They got in via jumping spiders, and now they're keeping Scolopendra. So I'm just like, what the hell what the hell just happened? So like, I get
right on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I give them ample amount of warnings and everything. I'm like, just a heads up. I'm like, it's not the same thing as the Fitibus. Definitely nowhere near that. But yeah, I definitely think that like jumping spiders have been like a quote unquote gateway species into arachnids as a whole, which is great. The whole, what's the correct term? Not personifying, or just like making like invertebrates more normal, so to speak, keeping them, I think, over quarantine with the explosion of TikTok and all those, like focusing on that helped a lot, for better or for worse, because like it's great, the hobby's growing, the species that I want are always out of stock, not so great. but it's a give and take. And what were we gonna say, Nick?
I was just going to say, I mean, even just looking at the development of the tarantula hobby in the last, 10, 15 years is crazy. I mean, thinking about, when like Gremstola pulchra was like originally like a hot commodity, and they still are, but like the rarity that they used to be versus now, and like the number of species that we've had introduced to the hobby that were like a total pipe dream for the longest time, T. Celadonia, Pemphibidius species Solaris, like the way that accessibility has also exploded, like the sheer number of vendors we have nowadays for tarantulas is mind blowing compared to what it used to be. I remember going to reptile expos and expecting like one table to have tarantulas. If you were lucky, maybe you'll get some wild caught spiders at like one of the big wholesale reptile dealer kind of tables as like a novelty. But now, you'll go and there's multiple different shops that are dedicated. I mean, you get like places like, Josh's Frogs. That's very like mainstream. Herps now carries a ton of different tarantula species. It's really crazy to see, and it's for good and bad. There's of course, good things that come and bad things that come with the found attention for the hobby, the expansion of the hobby, all that. But we're definitely living in a different era, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And then kind of going off of what you're seeing in stores, at least like I know back in the day, there was a number of vendors that were selling quote unquote wild caught Pamphobeteus, well, what's now Pamphobeteus, like species Antinous, or just like not the type species. But when you'd be ordering from them, it's a gamble what you would get. Would you get an actual Pamphobeteus species? Would you get a Megaphobema? Would you get a Lasiodora? You're just getting whatever is in that area that's a big black spider, regardless. Right. And they just like slap a label on it, which now we found is quite obviously wrong. And what
it's a Discalist. It's not.
Yeah. But like regarding that, do you like? I'm not sure about like the wild collection of these species. Do you do you ever buy wild caught, or are you ever interested in looking at like if a vendor has it? I'm not sure if they're still like coming in like large enough numbers to where people will be like having some tables of wild caught, like whip scorpions. Do you do you ever just walk by and kind of like take a peek and be like, oh, this species is incorrectly labeled and this is like complete something else? I'm just thinking about like the Asian fossorial Therphos day kind of mindset where it comes in as like, I don't know, like a Haplopelma minax, and it's not. It's quite obviously like not. It's something else. Do you ever do that, or have you come across that with like wild caught?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As far as Amblypygids go, there's very, very few people captive breeding them. I would say that I probably supply the majority of U.S. captive bred Amblypygids for the States. There's a couple people who import from Europe captive bred, and pretty much every single time that they even mention that they're thinking about bringing in something new, I'll pick it up. So for the most part, I've got my pulse on the new stuff coming in as far as imports go pretty well. So a big portion of finding anything else that we don't have access to is the wild caught stuff. And so pretty much anytime I go to an expo, I will comb every single table, look at every single wild caught container, because nothing is ever labeled correctly.
Yeah.
It's actually amazing. There's a good number of Whipspiders that come in from Central America with the label Phrynis mexicanus, which is not a valid species. No idea where that name came from or why it's slapped on everything that comes in wild caught. But that could be, different genera. It can be different species. And you kind of get a feel for, just by talking to people, where certain, imports are coming from. A lot of the time we're getting stuff from Nicaragua these days in terms of like the New World stuff. Mm-hmm. And then from there, it's that puzzle game of, okay, what does this match? Does this, mean that we're collecting from a different area now based on what's coming in? Because you'll see trends in what species come in wild caught, even across a country. Like for a while in Nicaragua, we were getting imports that looked like Phrynis white-eye, Phrynis mazie, and every once in a while, if you were really lucky, there's a Paraphrynis thrown in there that we thought was maybe Laverfrons for a little while, and then I went ahead and put it under scope, and it looks like something totally different. And now we're getting something that might be Laverfrons adjacent, along with white-eye, and it's clearly just shifted where people are collecting from. And honestly, that's very exciting for me. I get a lot of joy around finding these wild-caught animals and being able to kind of piece together pairs and breeding groups to kind of get them established in the hobby. I find that like super important because you never know, especially with so few people invested in keeping and breeding these, when this will be the last chance that we get to actually introduce these to the hobby and get them established. And so that's a big, like I said, mission of mine, is just to breed as much as I can, as much diversity as I can, and provide access to people for that kind of stuff.
And that's great to hear. I mean, it's refreshing to hear someone just like focusing on, like I probably said this before, but like focusing on something that's not like super mainstream right now. I mean, like jumping on like just like tarantulas and focusing on like T. Celedonia or the whole Solaris kind of train. So like, kudos to you for doing that. I will amend what I said before. I'm going to say Amblypygids now because I keep on mixing up the whip scorpions, whip spiders. So I do apologize for that.
No, I mean, it
but
happens. It's everybody mixes it up.
but but I kind of like your approach to how you were saying how you kind of like key them out when you get them, because not always like the ID always comes in, or just the location where they're from is coming in correct. I know that people in the reptile hobby and in the tarantula hobby in itself, if the location is off or where they were collected, they're like, I don't want that, or I don't want to deal with that, that kind of mess or whatever. But it's really great that to hear like, no, you're like, nope. If it's something new, no, like the general area, you'll buy a pair and kind of like key them out, kind of like, and like in that aspect. So that's really nice. How often does that happen? Usually, like, is it like pretty uncommon now, or do you like generally like when you go to like, I mean, I haven't been to White Plains yet. I want to, kind of scope it out, just because like a lot of the people I've been talking to for years go there. You, for example, Tom Patterson, a number of others, and but yeah, how do you not routinely, but do you come across new species every so often?
So it's interesting. It kind of it's not super consistent as far as like when it happens or how it happens. A lot of the times, I'll just like generally keep an eye on things, and we'll go maybe a year, year and a half, even 2 years without seeing anything new. Someone will send me a photo of something that they got from underground reptiles on order or something like that, and they'll be like, well, this doesn't look like the usual stuff that I see. Do you know what this is? And I'll immediately recognize, okay, this is something totally different. If it's coming from the same sources that we're seeing other stuff come in from, clearly something's changed, and that's when I'll start looking at things. And I'll maybe, with the really rare stuff, like the Paraphrynus that you only get like very, very sparingly in terms of those groups, I'll maybe find like one in Expo. So it's always an exciting thing of like, okay, do I finally have two different sexes now? After like a year of trying to collect these things, because obviously, like, even if you reach out to one of these big wholesalers and you try and ask them to like sort out something for you, like they don't know what is what. I mean, these are pretty base, like, subtle differences that if you're not super familiar with the groups, I'm not going to expect a reptile person to go in and determine different genera for me. Like that's a crazy expectation. So it is kind of a here and there thing. It has happened more in the last couple of years than in the past, but I think that we just got very lucky that the country that a lot of wild-caught animals are coming in from, not that that's the greatest thing in the world, is one with higher diversity, it would seem. So when you change areas of where you're collecting things, you're going to be getting new things. And of course, that's another one of the struggles, is I can tell that this, probably came from the same country, and it's something different, but I don't know where in the country it necessarily came from. So that makes IDs more difficult, and you can only be kind of approximate. So a lot of the times, when I separate out a line for the hobby, I'll just label it with some arbitrary label of like CF, this species, and then the country, just to designate it as an individual line that I can't necessarily say with 100% certainty where this came from or what it is, but that's like my best approximation. And so that's why I end up with a lot of these labels, when I'm even selling these animals that are, a whole line long, because I'm trying to give as much information as possible to people. And that's something I try and encourage with a lot of hobbyists. And it seems like there's a good amount of people now that are kind of pushing for this, to try and include as much data as possible in terms of like locality, just source and whatnot, that a lot of these things are coming from, because it does matter. But yeah.
Is there a reason that we're not seeing a lot of captive bred stock outside of the fact that there's just not a lot of people breeding them? But like, are they considered difficult? Are there some species that are considerably more difficult than others? Is like, what's sort of the genesis for that?
Yeah, I think the major reason is just that there aren't a ton of people breeding these animals. Like realistically, I can probably count on one hand the number of people I know in the States that are breeding Amblypygi, period. But there are definitely some species that are much more difficult to breed than others. In fact, like the Phrynis wide-eye, that is one of the common species that comes in from Nicaragua, is not as easy as a lot of the other species that I've had access to, and for a beginner it can be kind of tricky. There are species where the eggs are super sensitive to humidity; they can rot super easily. So you do have to strike a balance to have like good success with those. And then on the other side of that, one of the other kind of access points for Amblypygi in the hobby in terms of wild caught, it was the non-exotic species is our local endemic species. And part of those are the super arid species from the Southwest. And those are very difficult to breed. I myself have not successfully bred some of them. I only know a handful of people who have. And I think a lot of it is the conditions that your like animal room really is year round, because a lot of these are like super cyclical. They need rainy seasons. They need temperature fluctuations that can make that really difficult. So I think it's a mix of some of the common species that people get access to are very difficult to breed, and people just aren't as invested in breeding.
Is there sexual dimorphism in them like there is tarantulas in terms of like size and things like that, or are they fairly consistent?
So it varies species to species. I would say for the majority of Amblypygi, and generally I would say Phrynids especially, which are the New World group, there is a little bit of sexual dimorphism at minimum. Some are super dramatic. Like you'll have some of those species that the males have the ridiculous pedipalps versus the females. But some of them are very subtle, and you need to have kind of an eye for it. And the other thing is that unlike scorpions or mature male tarantulas, Amblypygi don't have ultimate molts. They sexually mature pretty early and then can do a lot of growing past that. So you can have a female of a species that is this big and a female of a species that is that big, and they're both sexually mature. So there's a ton of variation. And also like the amount of sexual dimorphism can also change by age, when a male can still be breeding viable very early, where you only start seeing the sexual dimorphism. So it is not super intuitive, I would say, is also part of it. A lot of people just don't realize.
What's the average lifespan?
So that's something we don't have a great idea of in the hobby. Just not a ton of people have been keeping these long term. It varies a bit species to species. I would say on average for Amblypygi, you're probably going to get like 10 to 12 years out of these guys. For some of the super arid, like more, I guess, I don't know how to put it, but your Rosea and Ophanopelma style life histories, where they're very slow growing, the metabolism is very low. You might get up to like 20 years, I've heard some people claim, out of some of these species. Personally, the oldest Amblypygid that I've worked with was a Damon diadema that actually just recently passed away, I think from a mold complication. Then she was, I believe, 13 years old, that I can verify. So they do get quite a bit of age to them, and there does not seem to be a huge difference in lifespan between males and females. Mature males slow down in feeding quite a bit, and they'll stay much thinner than females will, but for the most part, they do seem to have the same kind of lifespan capacity.
That's really interesting. I mean, that perfectly covers over like one of the other questions that I had just about their like life history or just how they yeah sexual dimorphism. But circling back, I assume with the way that I've seen like photos of like breedings and happen, there's no in like similar to scorpions and everything. It's all maternal incubation or like uh maternally kept for the most part. That I've never seen or heard of someone uh taking the eggs from the female like itself. But so yeah, that would I could see how that would be stressful too in general, especially with you working with like newer species and everything, where there's no data on in general, so you're just going off of like what's similarly like I'm sure you're looking at like the area they're from, kind of going off of like the environment and just making your best educated guess. But I could definitely see how that's like nerve wracking, uh, like kind of too as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I would say that a lot of it, at a certain degree, becomes intuition, and it's being able to like read your animals and how they respond to like changes in the environment. So when you know alter the humidity, like how do they behave? What kind of shelter space do they seem to be seeking is also one that's kind of important, because there are some species where the females will get very, very restless um, if they don't feel like they have a safe and secure place, which can be different than what a safe and secure place is to other species. Based on kind of some elements of their ecology. So it is difficult. And they do, like you mentioned, they extrude a brood sac on the underside of the abdomen that is attached to the female that they incubate the eggs in. So it cannot be removed. You can't do it artificially. And so essentially, it's a lot of monitoring those females, making sure the conditions are exactly correct, juggling, feeding them just enough without disturbing them, that kind of thing. Because they will feed both with eggs and with babies on their backs as well. So they're pretty good moms generally. Um, Obviously, if they are too stressed or the conditions change too dramatically, they will cannibalize their eggs like other groups. But for the most, like especially once the offspring hatch and she carries them for a little while, they're very very good moms. They tend to once you get to the hatching stage, they're almost always good to go. You get very few issues, and those issues that you do get, you can actually kind of deal with. One of the issues that I've run into is occasionally when you have the eggs hatch, as part of their life history, right? They'll hatch out from the underside of the abdomen, they'll crawl up on the female. They kind of cluster as like a ball around her abdomen for 7 to 11 days, usually about 10 to 11 days, before molting off to be fully motile. And when that happens, if you get a really large brood size, which can happen a lot in captivity because these females are usually very healthy, they're usually very well fed, so they're able to produce a lot of eggs. There'll actually be almost too many offspring for her to carry, and so you'll have cases where some fall off as they're molting on and whatnot. It doesn't happen all the time, and we don't have a hugely concrete reason for why it happens. One of my theories is that it is space related. There's only so much that she can carry. But regardless, when you actually see that happen, if you catch it early enough, you can actually artificially create space for the babies to hang on to, like a foam ledge or something like that. And they'll use it just like mom. They'll organize themselves just like they would on the mother, and then they'll molt off of it after the correct period of time. So there you can actually once you get them to the hatching stage, there are some elements of artificial incubation that you can kind of do. And I've had great success with that so far.
That's pretty interesting in itself. I wouldn't have thought of that. I've seen sometimes some babies fall off like some scorpion mothers, but I assume that's just like me accidentally like, startling them and them just falling off like that. But on the topic of just like caring for like caring for the moms or how the moms care, um, how do you care for them? Just because there's not that much information out there. I've seen photos of how you keep yours. I've seen that you use like some styrofoam, usually just as kind of just as kind of like not a hide. Blanking on the proper term to use, like a slanted piece of styrofoam for them. But yeah, could you go over like how you set them up, temperature wise? Are they more akin to like tarantulas, where quote unquote room temperature is okay for them, or do you give them external heat? I'm sure it depends on if they're aired or not. Um, but could you just give like kind of like the basic rundown on that?
Yeah, so generally, amblypygids, you can fulfill their base needs fairly easily in terms of needs of moisture, of feeding. They need some kind of like vertical or like slanted space to molt from. Kind of like mantises, they need that like space that they can hang to molt. And so a lot of time, like you mentioned, I'll set up very simplistic setups for species that I'm interested in breeding or I'm newly keeping. And a lot of people will be very surprised when they see how simplistic some of these setups are. But realistically, if you can fulfill the base needs of the animal and then be able to consistently monitor it, um, and make sure that it stays clean, you're able to take good precautions for cleaning regularly, feeding regularly, make sure it's eating, defecating, whatever regularly. It makes it a lot easier to make sure that the animal's healthy and that you're doing the right things, and that it's adjusting properly to captivity if it's a wild caught specimen a lot of times. So having that kind of styrofoam hangout area is easy to monitor. The feeding points, it's very clear that they're able to find and access their food if the cage isn't overly cluttered. So you can actually watch and ensure that happens. With mom and babies, it's very easy to keep good eyes on the egg sac as it develops. You can actually identify the embryos as they start to develop. And so I use a lot of those very simple enclosures where it's just like an enclosure with 2 or 3 times the leg span of the animals in height, like 1 or 2 pieces of slanted cork that allows them to kind of have a little place that they can shuffle away to, or foam. Styrofoam I use a lot of the time because it doesn't mold very easily. It's very easy to clean, and it is very clear to observe the animal. And then some level of moist or dry substrate depending on the needs of the animal. And that way, when you have those very simple enclosures, like I said, very easy to make sure that everything's going right. A lot of the times when I see people have issues with their Whipspiders, they're getting very small animals and putting them into very cluttered, complex enclosures. And a lot of the times people don't realize something's wrong until it's too late because they can't really tell what's going on. They can't tell if their animal's eating. They can't tell if their animal is behaving in a way where it looks like it needs more moisture. And so when I'm very invested in the success or the breeding of a species, I usually resort to these very like easy to observe enclosures. That being said, I do a ton of enclosures where I go way more complex, or I add like more realistic, natural style enclosures. I have fully planted vivariums that I keep some of my favorite specimens in. I have like, I guess you would say like luxury for some animals, because I am interested in creating those kind of like setups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
I
definitely.
seed for a second there, but hopefully I'm still connected.
Yep.
I definitely get what you mean by like more of a simple setup to monitor. I am usually when I get a first like a species in for the first time, mainly with scorpions, especially because my interests were more with the hot scorpions. I believe you call it just like particle board. It's what you like thumbtack stuff to. Just slanted that because
Yes, yeah.
I used cork bark once and they shoved themselves in, and I'm just like, all right, well, this is not working out for me because I can't like monitor you or whatever. But it's like simple is always best, especially when you're first getting into species, in my opinion. Just so like you can nail down the care properly for them, as well as see like what makes them tick, quote unquote. Especially more so with wild caught species. I was pretty over the top with coming from the reptile side into arachnids. Um, I've not kept any wild caught reptiles before, but I am like very mindful about like any kind of parasites, pathogens. I know that's not really like focused on, so to speak. But so like I kept them like very very clean, like anything coming from the outside, very clean and everything. So I do so I do like some of your setups like that. The styrofoam is a great idea. I don't know why I didn't think about that before. That could have saved quite a bit money down the line.
I'll have to say I can't take credit. I can't take credit for the styrofoam. That is Gil Wizen. He's a great keeper up in Canada. I think is the one who pioneered that idea,
Okay.
and who I took that from. And it has been a lifesaver. It is not only much cheaper to work with, but it also has a lot of added benefits.
Yeah, definitely. Do you see that? So probably more of a like silly question, but do you because you did mention you have like plant enclosures, do you keep them on like a light cycle kind of thing, or is it or I assume many of them are pretty like photosensitive, judging by like where they're usually found and how nocturnal they are.
Yeah, so generally I have a pretty basic day-night cycle. With the planted enclosures, I do use like standard grow lights, but I make sure that they have dark areas to retreat to. Um, so obviously some of those enclosures are not the best viewing enclosures because they still need to fit the needs of the animal and whatnot. Um, but yeah, I generally try to keep a decent day-night cycle. I don't think it's the end of the world if they don't get a super clear day-night cycle. These are animals that are very, very reclusive and, like you said, photosensitive. Um, so they really, really prefer the nice dark kind of areas. Some of them are even cave adapted. So you get animals that are very specifically accustomed to being in the dark a majority of the time. But yeah, for the most part, a photo period is good for them, I would say. And to kind of circle back, I realized I didn't cover temperatures. For the most part, I would say that Amblypygi are fine with room temp, but they do a lot better with a little bit of heat.
Mm-hmm.
However, in that regard, that's also such a thing as being too hot. I keep my entire animal room at about 74, 75 degrees during the day, maybe drop it a teeny bit at night, but generally around there. And that seems pretty comfortable for most species. Um, but going past 80 can be too hot for a lot of species, because obviously these are animals that are kind of in these cool, humid microhabitats a
Right.
lot of the time, and they do seem to be sometimes a little bit sensitive. And also, of course, the hotter you keep it, especially if you're heating a whole room, the drier it is, and you have to be more mindful of adding water and whatnot. Additionally, there are, I suspect, some species, some of the Asian species in the genus Cattageus do seem to be a little bit heat sensitive, even past that, where they've seemed to have been done better when I've kept them like 68 or colder, where they do seem to appreciate some of those cooler temperatures. I know that's been the case for some, I guess you would say, like highland centipedes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is
or
there like montane species? Is there like montane?
I don't know enough about the ecology of those species, and I think just generally not super well known to really make that determination. But it wouldn't surprise me if there's some element of their natural like habitat that is cooler that way. And again, this is kind of a hypothesis because there's only so many people who've kept these, and it's a lot of the times my anecdotal like, maybe this specimen did better at this temperature because it was just a healthier wild caught specimen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of, I believe the genus they got put into a new genus, Abdomegaphobema mesomelas.
Right. Yeah.
How back in the day, I know like back when I started, there was a big debate on like temperature wise, and the people who ended up having most success actually use like wine coolers, like so to speak, because and I think last time I checked, which was a number of years ago, there was like, oh, why isn't my male breeding properly? It's like, oh, you like someone hypothesized that because he was kept at so and so temperature, he became sterile, quote unquote. I don't know
Same.
what what led to that kind of conclusion, or if there was other things wrong, because not many people want to invest in like a $200+ spider without like knowing how to breed it. I know people in Europe probably have bred them. They haven't, as always, they have, oh, not as always, but like they haven't shared like the and like what they did for the breedings for them. But I'm kind of curious, and it makes sense because they're a cloud forest species from Costa Rica. So yeah.
When are we going to Costa Rica, dude?
That would be the dream.
It's at the top of the list.
Costa Rica is a beautiful place. I was able to go very, very briefly for like a week, 10 days in undergrad, and wow, of all the places that I've been able to visit for fieldwork or any other reason, I mean, like the proper jungle of Costa Rica is something else. It's outstanding.
They've got scorpions, they've got spiders, they've got dart frogs, they've got snakes. Like I'm set. They've got everything I could possibly want to see.
Yeah, Costa Rica really appeals to me because they have like the highlands, like the montane area, as well as just like the actual tropical areas. I did a lot of my research in undergrad in Ecuador and Peru, up in the Andes and also the Amazon. So like, I always love having those two like differentials within like the same, not a few hour drive, just going up, just like driving and seeing at each elevation mark, seeing how species diversity changes. That was like absolutely amazing, and I'd love to just spend some time in Costa Rica, just like renting a car and just looking for anything I can find. I need to check the legalities of that. I'm really also into plants, and they have a great anthurium diversity over there too, so that'd be really neat. But I digress. So,
getting into the paper that recently got published, can you kind of the rundown as far as that, and what was the catalyst for making that happen?
Sure, yeah. So that paper was concerning Paraphrynus in the Southwest, particularly Arizona, a little bit branching into Nevada and California, though I didn't do much field work there. I did most of my field work in Arizona. And essentially the whole kind of summary of that paper is splitting this one existing species into two species. Based on some new collections that we made, some additional looks at the existing material, the existing descriptions, and I guess kind of to start at where that paper's inception came from. I don't know the exact dates on everything, but there was a period of time where a fellow hobbyist that I work with a good amount, Alan Gian, came to me as he had just been out collecting in Arizona, and he works on every invertebrate under the sun. He keeps just about everything that you could think of, obscure or not. And he came across he and a group of others came across an Amblypygid from Nogales, Arizona, like way down right on the border. That was super unusual. It looked very different than what we had been calling in the hobby Paraphrynus carolinae, which was like the standard Arizona Amblypygid for the longest time. And so he and Kai Wang sent me photos of this. They asked, these look way different. They even already had made some like observations of like the color of the pedipalps was a little bit different in these specimens versus what they were standard seeing. And kind of the initial reaction was, oh, wow, maybe this is a new species, or maybe this is a new record for the US. Maybe this is a Mexican species this is the first time it's been observed, or maybe it's brand new. And the first name that we floated was Paraphrynus mexicanus, as potentially a new record for the US. And pretty quickly it was like obvious that was not the animal that we were looking at. And so the assumption was, oh, well, they're definitely different from whatever else we have in Arizona. Maybe it's a new species. So that was very exciting. And then upon kind of planning some collections and making a couple collections, I was going through and checking type localities and paratype localities and all that to kind of plan where I was going to collect some of these animals for genetic analysis and morphological analysis in the lab. And I noticed that the 2012 paper that described Paraphrinus carolinae, the type locale is in Sonora, Mexico, and the paratype locale is in Tucson, Arizona. If you don't know, those are very, very, very far apart. So that would either mean that the species has a super wide range, or potentially that the paratype and holotype are not the same. And there was no genetic data in that original description, just morphological. So I went ahead and we went and collected specimens from a couple different places in Arizona, Nogales, Tucson, Phoenix, a bunch of different places. We hit the paratype locale in Sabino Canyon. It got all these specimens back to the lab, and then upon looking at them, it became very clear. One, they are different. However, looking at the original description and some of those specimens, it definitely seemed like the Nogales specimen might be the actual Paraphrinus carolinae that matches the holotype, and that the new thing was actually what we had been calling Paraphrinus carolinae the whole time in the U.S. hobby, and that true carolinae had just not been, known from the U.S. Luckily, we had a bunch of Sonoran samples already in the collections at the museum. I was able to sequence the new stuff, and it shook out pretty clearly that the Nogales stuff is very distinct from the Tucson and Phoenix stuff, and the specimens from Sonora shook out the same way, that the Sonoran specimens showed a pretty big disparity from the Tucson and Phoenix specimens, and a much smaller disparity from the Nogales stuff. And there was still a little bit of a disparity there. When we talk like genetic distances, to give you guys kind of an idea, the baseline that we had set was that the genetic distance for the smallest genetic distance for a morphologically clear species in all of Amblypygi was in a daemon species, and was between daemon species, and it was like 12.56% or something like that. And so the difference that we observed, I don't remember off the top of my head, is something around like 13.4 or something like that. So it was a clear species boundary, but the difference between the Sonoran specimens and the Nogales specimens was like 6%. Versus, if you compare Tucson to Phoenix, you had like 0.0 whatever percent. So there's still like a little bit of disparity there that unfortunately we don't have a ton of specimens to go deeper into at the moment, but that's something I'm interested in for the future. But yeah, essentially the whole rundown is this weird case of mistaken identity, where the original description had accidentally put a holotype and a paratype that were different species together. And so it was a little puzzle of kind of sorting out that mystery using genetics, and then some elements of morphology, where basically I clarified a couple of good characters that you can use to separate them. And as part of that, I really wanted to designate some characters that are very clear and easy to just use by naked eye. I think a really important part of taxonomy, especially when we're talking about accessibility to citizen science, is making it so that it's something that anybody can look at two specimens and understand. So I included elements of coloration and juvenile coloration as clear characters that are reliable for the two species. So it was kind of a fun little project to name this new species, make a good clarification, and ultimately designate a clearly identifiable Paraphrinus tucdot is the new species.
Yeah, I find that utterly really cool. Like the whole speciation, like the difference between species really fascinates me. But congrats again on that, and also big shout out for being for making it more easily digestible especially for as you mentioned, people who are in citizen science or who do contribute, and just inserting keys using coloration and everything, because I do know when I was doing community outreach events and breaking down papers and everything, it was a lot of people not going after any like scientists in general for what they're like what they're putting out. Um, but just like I think things like that is is a great way of bringing in people more people in, like into the sciences, and more just making it more easily digestible, and making it not seem like it's worlds apart, which is like what I've been told um, a lot. But yeah, that was really yeah, that I just skimmed through the paper, and that was like really I just thought it was really cool in general, just because once again, Amblypygids didn't know didn't know much about them, or the diversity within the United States itself. And I did have a quick question. Is your main would your main focus be, like, would you say, like, right now, or interest on the species within the United States, or just
So the species within the United States have kind of like a special place for me.
Mhm.
Because obviously, being from the U.S. and being able to access these species, so close to home, it's super important for me that we have a good understanding of them. Like, they're right in our backyards. We have no excuse for not knowing what we have, and we have a really poor understanding at this time of the diversity that we have, of just understanding the ranges of species that we have, and even like the sensitivities of certain species that we have in Florida. Some of the best habitat for our native species are these like tropical hardwood hammocks that are like, I don't know if endangered is necessarily the proper word, but imperiled habitats, that are not in
It's a running theme with Florida currently.
Yeah, not in copious supply, I guess. But yeah, I as a general rule, my focus and the scope of my dissertation covers all of Phrynidae, so the whole New World group, I guess you could say. Though there is one Old World representative that's super weird, super interesting. And I'm basically trying to kind of start at a baseline to clarify the upper level relationships. So make a clear plan of like what all the genera and the family actually look like, how we can clearly designate them, and all that is part of my interest. And along the way, I'm doing some species descriptions and what have you. But yeah.
How do the western, like southwestern stuff and things from the other side of the country compare to stuff like what you find in Florida, which is just the one species in Florida, correct?
So that's a bit of an interesting question. So we technically have two species that you can find in Florida.
Okay.
One is Phrynis marginimaculatus, which is like the tried and true for sure native Florida whip spider, and the other is Paraphrynis, what we have labeled so far as cubensis. And so those resemble the species from Cuba. As from what I've keyed out, they look identical. I think it could just be an introduction. It's not uncommon for those kinds of things to happen. I'm going to run some analyses and see genetically what they look like. That's something that I am interested in. But for the most part, it is just those two species, and they are very different than what we have in the Southwest. And kind of understanding where they come from, and how they were kind of made their way to Florida evolutionarily is kind of important for that. So when we look at the biogeography of whip spiders, there is a huge amount of diversity in the Caribbean, be it on the Greater Antilles or the Lesser Antilles, where you get a lot of different species island to island, but also a good amount of species exchange from mainland to islands in certain groups. So it's not super clear when the colonization events happen in certain areas, but likely, these species that are in Florida came from some Caribbean colonization at some point, with some origin in Central or South America, from what we know about the group. So what kind of comes up through the mainland on the western side is very different and not closely related to what we get in Florida at the end of the day.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's super interesting. There's also, like I said, some contention of whether or not the Paraphrynus cubensis that we see in Florida or whatever that ends up being is, cubensis or not. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, I would call them cubensis at this point.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And then as far as like, is it the same with like the vinegaroons? Is it a similar scenario where the ones that are found in Florida are...
So that I'm less familiar with. I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to speak incorrectly as far as that goes. I know that they all share the same genus.
Mm-hmm.
I believe there was actually like a Mystigoproctus is the genus revision not too long ago. So that might be a good place to look for that kind of thing. I'm not sure what exactly that covered. I know it covered a lot of the Southwest stuff. Yeah.
Overall, I mean, how would you, in terms of general care and stuff, would you consider whips to be, about the same as most arachnids that are in the hobby? You'd consider them a little easier, a little more sensitive? Sort of, where would you, as far as like availability of common species, where would you place them?
I would say that for the most part, for captive bred stuff, there is a huge quantity of super, hardy, indestructible species. A lot of your Phrynis, like Phrynis barbadensis, Phrynis mazie, Phrynis white-eye, in terms of just general care-wise, those guys really, really difficult to mess up. They're very easy. They're very hardy, very easy to feed. They're great eaters for the most part. They grow quickly. They get an okay size. So for the most part, there's a lot of really accessible, super easy to care for stuff. There are more obscure species in the hobby that are trickier. But for the most part, unless you're like really plugged into getting like the newest or like the rarest stuff, that's not really going to be an issue. I think a lot of the sensitivity that people experience comes from wild caught specimens. A lot of the time, especially the specimens that come from Africa, do not come in great shape. They're either super dehydrated or they're super beat up, or they're kind of shoved in shipping containers with like a little bit of moss or some dirt. And they rattle around for forever, and they come in and they've got, broken limbs, the dehydration, bludgeoning issues. So I think people very frequently will pick those up expecting them to be, easy to recuperate and take care of. And a lot of times those need very intensive, very specific care, like hand feeding, that kind of stuff, to really kind of bounce back properly. And even then, sometimes they don't.
Right.
So I think that there's a little bit of a misconception that whipspiders can be a little bit delicate, and they are like delicate by nature, but they're not hard to take care of if you kind of know the basics, I would say.
I know you mentioned some species, but like, would you say those species you mentioned are like good quote unquote beginner ones, like similar to when people like are looking to get into tarantulas, the most common question is, what's the best beginner tarantula?
Right.
And like, so to speak, like would you recommend like if there's one clear species that you would recommend for someone who's looking to get into whips, what would you recommend?
Right. I would say, so there's a lot of good options. I think so in terms of accessibility, I think Phrynis mazie and Phrynis white-eye are probably the easiest accessible species because they're very commonly wild caught. You can kind of get them almost anywhere. And those, even when they come in wild caught, tend to be a bit sturdier. Doesn't mean that you can't get an unhealthy specimen, but for the most part, they're pretty easy. When it comes to captive bred, which are a lot harder to come by because it's kind of happening pretty sparingly, things like that Phrynis barbadensis and its relatives, so Phrynis barbadensis, Phrynis gozii, Those like kind of moderate size Caribbean Phrynis are all really great. They're super, super hardy in terms of humidity. If they dry out, they're pretty tolerant for a good while. So if you do, for whatever reason, have an issue where you don't get the humidity quite right, or you don't get the ventilation quite right, they're super forgiving of that. They're also like phenomenal eaters. They'll take prey within like 30 seconds of it hitting the enclosure. So they're super, super, super tough in that regard. I think for the most part, I'd recommend that people stay away from the wild-caught daemon from Africa. I think they can be, healthy daemon can be easy, but a lot of the times you're just not going to get that. And there's a lot of stories I've heard where people will bring one home and it's dead within like 3 days, which always is a terrible experience for people when they're first trying to get into the hobby and that kind of thing.
Do you think that struggle with those, the more difficult or more delicate species, is it mostly a hydration thing? Or is it more of like a ventilation? Like what's sort of the pathology, if you will, of losing those?
Yeah, when it comes to those wild-caught daemon, I think hydration is the number one. But I also think that a lot of times, like I said, they come in just beat up. Like they've just got,
Physical
internal
trauma.
injuries or physical trauma that really screws them up. As far as those go, I think that's the majority of losses. In terms of captive bred stuff, when you do have more sensitive species, I think the number one things are either hydration. It's very easy to dry these guys out. Like pretty much all Amblypygi are dependent on some humid microhabitat. Even the like arid species need some element of humidity. And I usually cycle humidity for those. So I'll, wet the substrate pretty heavily, let it fully dry out, and then do it again, that kind of stuff. And especially when you're working with these super teeny tiny captive bred whipplings, they're very sensitive.
Extremely sensitive to that, right?
Yeah. It's the same thing as like a lot of the tarantula world, where the the cuticle's so thin that they'll dry out like that if you let them.
What substrate are you using for them? As far as, is it sort of the standard?
So yeah, I've done a bunch of different things. The most common is just cocoa fiber, but I have tried to basically generate my own custom substrate for a majority of the stuff that I curate, which I change depending on the species. But for the most part, it's a mix of topsoil, cocoa, gravel, sand, and some clay to kind of get a varied kind of texture to the substrate that can hold a little shape. As there are some species that'll kind of like move dirt around a little bit. They're not burrowing. None of Amblypygi are burrowing. But you'll get some species like the Southwest species that'll actually kind of like dig out a little area underneath of a piece of foam or cork that they can kind of dip into as like a shallow
like
scrape,
divot or something.
Yeah, kind of. And so that kind of gives them a little bit more of something to do, I think. But generally, as long as your substrate can kind of hold moisture and isn't going to get like horribly moldy, you're usually fine. And actually, speaking to a little bit to mold, Amblypygi are a lot less sensitive to mold and that kind of stuff than a lot of other inverts are. There's not really any concern for mycosis. You do get some cases where some species will have more sensitive eggs, especially. But the animals themselves, like a lot of species, will even curate fungal growth on themselves just naturally as part of the exoskeleton. So you'll see like some of these heterophrynus get kind of like a cloudy look to them because they live in these super humid environments, and they'll just have like little bits of fungi and mold growing on them. And it doesn't harm the animals. So I always recommend to people to just spot clean when you can. As long as it's not insane, it's not a problem. Because these, like I said, these animals come from these humid microhabitats where they tend to be very stuffy conditions, and it's
right. I would hope that they would kind of be more.
Yeah, they're resilient, exactly.
Yeah, more resilient to molds and things like that. Food wise, I mean, are you like, do they do better with smaller meals? Are they capable of taking sort of bigger things?
Yeah, so they, for the most part, it does vary a little bit species to species. I feed most of my stuff crickets or small roaches. Um, the big thing is the dubias are kind of crappy for them, as popular as they are for a lot of other stuff, because dubias kind of do a bit of burrowing. They're not
Yeah.
super active. The more active the prey for Amblypygi, the better, because they're really feeling with those antenniform legs to kind of get a feel for where their prey is, tracking it down, all that stuff. As far as size goes, a lot of the phrynids will take just anything. I mean, I've seen like teeny tiny, like the body size of about that for a Canthophrynus, take a large cricket with ease. They're tough. They're surprisingly tough in terms of what they can go after. The exception, of course, being the spearing species that I talked about before, like your Euphrenicus and stuff like that. They need much smaller prey. I generally try and give them like a quarter of the size of their carapace, maybe half the size at biggest. Because of that like spearing action, they have a lot less leverage, it seems like, and they're a lot more spooked by bigger prey. But yeah, generally it's kind of similar to the rule for tarantulas, where like you try and give them a meal the size of their carapace maybe. I feed usually about once a week or once every 2 weeks, depending on my schedule. And everybody does pretty well that way. The smaller animals need a little more attention or a little bit more meals, but for the most part, they're pretty sturdy. The exception again being Acanthophrinus that I mentioned before. Those big, colorful Mexican species have a much higher metabolism, and especially when they're young, they'll eat like 2 times a week, maybe more, because they're growing so quickly. You can go from, leg span of about that big and like a second instar to adult in the span of a year, with proper attempts in feeding, and they'll get like just huge.
Massive. Wow.
Yeah, and so they're kind of like the Theraphosa or Lasiodora of Amblypygids, kind of in that way. So they'll take a lot more food, but generally it's pretty easy. I would say the big thing that people definitely kind of get confused on is trying to feed things like dubia roaches or superworms or whatnot. And those things can be okay if you're pre-killing and providing for scavenge.
Right.
Pretty much all whipplings, kind of like tarantulas, will scavenge. I've had pretty much every single species I've ever worked with take pre-killed feeders. And especially for the teeny tiny guys, the brand new second, third instar whipplings, that's one of the best ways to monitor that your animal is eating. Is put the pre-killed food in a very specific spot, see if it gets moved, or you can observe it coming down to investigate the item and that kind of thing. Which I think is really good for new keepers to see, so that they're confident that their animal's eating. They have an idea of what it should look like. And additionally, Amblypygids don't really seem to have the issues with overfeeding that tarantulas and some other like true spiders and stuff can have. They have a pretty strict limit for the amount that they'll eat, and some species will balloon up a little bit, but it's not really a concern where they're going to fall or injure themselves or overeat. If they get to the like halfway through a prey item and they decide they're done, they'll just toss it. Kind of a little similar to mantises in that way, I would say.
They have self-control.
So that makes them a little easier, I think. Yeah.
Is communal?
Communal is it's a big question. So communal tendencies are very weird in Amblypygids. A lot of people like to say that some Amblypygid species are strictly communal, or like they totally do fine in groups, and the answer is very complex. So a lot of people will suggest that you always do sibling groups for these kinds of things, but those will also deteriorate. The biggest kind of factor for communal tendencies is really related groups from the same clutch and the mother will be fine together for long periods of time. And that's actually something I do in my breedings, where I'll have a clutch hatch and I'll keep them all together with mom for the first probably 4 to 5 instars, where they'll stay together, they'll eat together, molt together. Mom will be very tolerant of them. And that's the case for pretty much every species I've worked with. There have been a couple exceptions. Like there's one undescribed Phrynis that I work with from the Caribbean that, for whatever reason, are super cannibals. The first 2 times that I attempted anything like that, I ended up with like 3 individuals out of 20, which is crazy. I mean, it was totally unexpected because all of these other species, even like the super food aggressive, like the Lasiodora theraphosa types, super tolerant of conspecifics for that first couple instars. And it really seems to be that when they start having that like sexual maturity, sexual dimorphism cutoff of development, that's when they'll start being more territorial, more cannibalistic, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they're pretty tolerant for those first like 4 or 5 instars. You'll get a little cannibalism here and there, depending on how well you provide food, of course, and all that. But that's generally good. As far as keeping adults together goes, that is generally not a good idea in my experience. I've had some pairs do okay long term, depending on species, and then some pairs that within a week the male gets eaten. No matter how much food I provide the female or whatnot. And especially when they go to molt, that is the case where a lot of cannibalism occurs. So I generally don't recommend people try communal enclosures unless they're really willing to take a lot of losses in the process. I've seen some things work with like Phrynis marginimaculatus, the native Florida species that we have. When you provide a ton of like hiding spots,
right.
And
there's a lot of space for them to get away from each other and things like that.
Right, but I think in those cases, like you're just basically establishing a terrarium where each has a pretty clear individual territory that just doesn't go near any of the others. So it's not really communal. Whereas when you have these like family groups for a clutch, you'll watch like the mother, seismic communicate with the antenniform legs to the babies. They'll communicate between each other, kind of like a "Hey, I'm here" signal.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really cool to observe. So if anyone out there is interested in breeding them, I do highly recommend kind of getting to get those observations because it is really cool. But there is a pretty strict limit to it, I would say. I think.
How do they reproduce in comparison to tarantulas and scorpions?
So similar to scorpions, they have kind of a mating ritual and kind of spiders in some degree, but it's in the way that I have seen a lot of scorpions do that little like song and dance sort of dealio. They'll do some elements of that, and it changes species to species, where you'll have like whip taps and strokes, that seismic communication to one another. They'll kind of square up face to face. The male will like angle his pedipalp certain ways. And then you get kind of like little differences between courtship species or genus to genus. For example, like in Damon, the males will kind of like punch the female with their palp like very gently, just over and over, like, hey, for the first 20, 30 minutes of introduction. It's just part of like kind of getting the female into the mating trance or whatever. And then there are some that are very, abrupt, so to speak. The Acanthophrynis, especially. Every time, because the Acanthophrynis, I had the first major or the most recent major import of from Canada. And so in kind of then dispersing those from my breedings, every time that I send them to someone who's interested in breeding, I tell them, if you're going to breed these things, be prepared. They will get a little violent. Because the males actually, as part of the courtship, will charge and just like full strike the females. Jeez. In a way that, if you're not ready for it, looks just like, aggressive behavior. But essentially he'll just keep, running up and striking her until she'll back off and just sit in like a corner. And so he'll turn around and go find a place to lay a spermatophore and then come get her.
Okay, so they do use spermatophores.
Yes, they do. That was my next move. They'll lay like a little spermatophore stalk, and then the male will guide the female over it. And generally, kind of the structure of courtship is introduction, whip taps. You'll see either positive behavior or territoriality or even hunting behavior. It'll become very clear if the male or if the female intends to eat the male a lot of the time. And then once you get past that initial introduction, they'll start doing the regular courtship ritual where like certain genera, you'll have very clear identifiers like the punching or whatnot, until eventually they get to the stage where the male's ready to lay the spermatophore. And so he'll fully turn around and face away from the female, lay the spermatophore, curate it, make sure it's proper shape and everything, and then he'll turn around and continue and guide the female over to pick up the spermatophore. And then once she picks it up, they pretty instantly split, go their separate ways, and dip. There are some species that'll still sit and like sit face to face and court multiple times in an evening. Like if you leave like some Phrynis together, they'll make like 2 or 3 spermatophores in an evening.
Wow.
Or like Euphrynicus also breed like rabbits. They like will just drop spermatophore after spermatophore, and they're very easy to. A lot of those species tend to be the easiest to breed. They're very receptive most of the time. Oh, and that was a point I wanted to briefly cover in terms of communal. The Euphrynicus are the one that are super weird. They're more tolerant. They're a very specialized spear feeding species, and I kept a pair together until the female I think passed away from old age or mold complications pretty recently for like years at a time, and they were totally chill together. Multiple molts, no problems, and they breed super consistently. Like you almost have to do nothing, and they'll just keep going. And it seems like a lot of European keepers have had success keeping those in harems. Well, you'll keep one male and multiple females, and they'll do fine. And it's just multiple males will duel. I haven't had the opportunity to test it myself with like a huge group of them, but I intend to, and that might be something of kind of interest. But with a species that is like not terribly accessible, like I think just recently Tom Patterson has them for like $60 a piece. For tiny whipplings on his site. You may not want to invest in like $300 of animal to end up with $60 of animal.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things. But yeah, courtship is super varied and interesting among Amblypygids. You'll even get some species in the genus Charon from like the Philippines, Papua, that kind of region of the world. Will have some elements of seismic communication like tarantulas. Mm-hmm. So the male will actually like tap his front legs that aren't the antenniform legs on the whatever they're standing on to get the female's attention. So that they've got a whole bunch of different weird little quirks when you actually sit down and observe the whole ritual.
That's really interesting that they have like that wide diversity of like tactics, because I was just thinking like, oh, it's either going to be like similar to like scorpions, like I would assume, and granted that scorpions have like a certain amount of variability with their mating practices, but I didn't expect that much of a difference at all. But that's super interesting. That must have been like, especially when working with some of the newer species or undescribed species with you, like when you first tried to breed them, that must have been excuse me, that must have been an interesting time, especially because like I know like tarantulas, you like generally like have like a paintbrush in hand to break them apart, but I don't know how you would break apart some like some of those pairs, especially like seeing the male charge for the first time, not knowing.
Yeah.
And I mean, they're pretty fast.
They're super fast, and also like you can't really like have the enclosure open or be ready with like anything because like they're so sensitive to like just like breathing and like little air movements and whatnot. So a lot of times I'm sitting there in the dark with like a red headlamp because they won't like be disturbed by a red light, just watching them very closely so that like if one goes for the other, I'll like quickly open the enclosure and try and get in there. I've successfully separated some, and then sometimes, I mean, most of the time you can tell when you introduce them that it's not going to go well pretty quickly. Yeah. But there have been some cases where I had actually a male of one species just instantly snap on a female from just like total normal, like courtship. They're doing fine. And then instantly he speared her and killed her within like 30 seconds. And I was like, all right,
well, she said the wrong thing. She said something you didn't like.
I guess so. And then there are also cases
where
Nickelback. There are also be cases where like when you're not expecting what the courtship will look like. There was one instance where I was pairing a species and I sat there, I think, for like 5 hours just like listening to podcasts or whatever, and they were just in that same like whip tapping stage where I thought they were still just doing introductions, and I was like, what is going on? Like, and there were several instances of this across like a couple months where I would just like wait a while, and if nothing happened, I'd separate them, and was so confused as to why nothing was happening. And then I let them go at it for like a full overnight, and turns out just like at some point during the night, the male just decided, okay, I'm good, and turned around, laid the spermatophore, and they paired. There was just no like
hours of negotiations.
Yeah, it was very, very bizarre. So it's a lot of that like trial and error, figuring out like what certain species kind of do and how they operate. So it's a puzzle game for sure.
What's the typical gestation?
Typical gestation is about 3 months, from laying eggs to hatching. As far how long it takes for them to go from mating to laying eggs can be kind of variable. It's generally a couple months, but they can also begin to develop eggs pre-fertilization. So that also kind of plays a part into it. And you can observe those on the underside of a female through like the like pleural folds between the tergites. So if you for whatever reason see that a female is already well developed, has well developed eggs, that is a good sign to, okay, maybe I should pair her sooner rather than later before she molts out or whatnot.
Do they retain sperm at all, or is that like a species by species kind of thing?
So generally, I would say that they retain sperm. I've not yet observed a clear instance where a pair will mate, the female will molt, and then she'll still lay viable eggs. But it's not something that we're like concretely sure of, I would say. I think generally the assumption is that no, that they can't retain it between molts. But like, for example, recently we were under the assumption that a lot of these species can only produce one set of eggs per molt cycle, just by like regenerating the membrane used to contain the eggs and everything like that. And then lo and behold, we've had a bunch of instances pop up where, they've double clutched totally viably. So, there's a lot we don't know, I would say. So I wouldn't be surprised to find that there is some species out there that can retain. There are species with, things like parthenogenesis. So you never know.
How is that common with species in the group?
So it kind of depends on the subgroup. So like the genus Carinus, there's a few species that are very clearly parthenogenic. I think the one parthenogenic species that we have very commonly in the hobby is Carinus acosta from Cuba, I believe. And they're super, super teeny tiny, like, adult size is lifespan about that big.
Wow.
And so the offspring are like tiny pinhead size, like feeding on springtails kind of size stuff. And they'll have very, very small clutches as well. And that's an important thing to touch on too. Those like tiny Carinus will have a clutch of like 4 eggs, maybe. Versus, tarantulas where even like the small clutches, you'll get like 30 or more. But top end for Amblypygi is I think the most I've ever had from a clutch was like 65-ish from like a really large species and a really, really large adult female. But for the most part, they have very small clutches. And I think that's probably in part due to the air that the females put into them. You're never going to get the 2,000 offspring that you get from like Lesiodora or whatnot. But yeah, I would say it's probably not much higher than that top end wise for clutch size, which makes it easier to take on breeding projects, I will say. But also, makes them a little more scarce captive bred because there's only so many per breeding cycle.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we're past the 2-hour mark, sir. Did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
No, I mean, I'm just taking up this information for the.
Yeah, this is going to be
time.
A rabbit hole. I'm going to be free falling down.
Yeah. Sorry to bombard you guys with so much information.
No, I mean, like this is amazing because like because I was like looking around before, because I was like looking like brainstorming ideas for like the podcast who to have on and everything. And the one thing that I've kind of noticed, not just on podcast platforms, but also like YouTube videos and then just like posts on arachno boards and stuff like that, that this order is very not,
Underrepresented.
yeah, underrepresented. It's like severely. So this is great. I mean, you're going to be hearing from me regardless. So about like basic questions and everything in the future when I am able to keep them, because like I would love to kind of delve into them. They're something new and exciting, and well, for me, new. And yeah, that was all like amazing information, and I do. Yeah, I'm just soaking that in.
It was one of those things that I knew they existed, but I didn't realize they existed in the variety that they do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I always
So.
thought they were just like still massively like, again, in my in my very small-minded brain, I thought, I'm like, oh, it's just like there's not that much variety as you said, and like nobody really like works with these super well up until I met you, and then yeah, it's just yeah.
I mean, I'm just appreciative of you guys giving me the opportunity to talk about these. I'm always happy to talk, on end about all various topics concerning Amblypygi. And if you are ever interested in really getting into them, you know who to ask. I have them available most of the year.
Yeah.
Some species, one of the others. So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah.
And I'm sure like a lot of people who are listening to like this podcast would be interested too. Do you happen to have like a good way to like for people to contact you with questions, or just in general if they're like
So
wanted to get some?
unfortunately, I don't have a website or anything like that. But I'm super approachable on Facebook and Instagram. You can find me at Nick Cazzaniga or Nicholas Cazzaniga. Just shoot me a DM. I'm always happy to provide current stock list. Obviously, it's winter now, so a lot of the shipping season is pretty much done. But I always try and do my best to keep people informed as to what I've got going on. I'm always happy to answer questions as well. Don't be afraid to shoot me a question whenever. But yeah, and again, I want to just make sure I reiterate. Thank you guys so much for having me on for this. It is an absolute pleasure to get to talk about this stuff and kind of share some of my experience.
Yeah, no problem, man. I do appreciate you taking time out. You're taking time out to talk. You are a student, and that's what I want to preface this for anyone who is going to be contacting him. He is a student. Give him some leeway, like when it comes to things. I definitely remember being bombarded with a lot of things when I was a student, and just made my head explode sometimes. But yeah, no, man. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule for this. This was great, and I know we even within this past 2 hours we just hit the surface of what I'm sure
I'm sure there will be a part 2 at some point.
Yeah,
we'll have more questions. So
I'd love to be back. So that sounds good to me.
Well, this was episode 5 of ArachNerds, brought to you by FulviusApparel.com. Once again, Black Friday month sale going on now until the 30th. I think they're doing Flippin' 10 tomorrow, so tune in live. I need to double check with Jake, but that'll be posted in the announcement there. We didn't do Snakes and Stogies this week. We had a guest lined up. Guest had to reschedule. We didn't have a backup plan, so we ended up just sort of bailing last minute. But other than that, we should be back Monday. And then we'll be back here for episode 6 at some point here soon. We try to make them happen fairly regularly. So we appreciate it. Everybody have a good evening. We'll see you later.
Hope you guys have a great evening.